can't make it to the session. Connor, thank you so much for being here. I'm so excited to talk to you about how your team has been using Scribe. I know you've been using Scribe for a little over a year now. And maybe just start out, just tell us a little bit about the structure of your team, your role and responsibilities, and how that relates to process documentation.
Absolutely. Happy to be here. So Coronis Health, we are a revenue cycle management company. We work in the healthcare space. We basically provide services to physician practices on the back end. So we're kind of like a BPO company. We work off of roughly 55 or 60 different software platforms. So as you can imagine, standardizing and organizing the different workflows and kind of best practices per software is extremely difficult. So that's kind of like what Coronis is. My job and kind of team responsibility is really centered around, we call it operational excellence. So how do we ensure that we are doing things the most efficient way possible? And then how do we analyze those super users and how they are doing these types of processes as well? I kind of started off in the analytics space in terms of creating different types of reporting outputs and different, basically different intricate processes that would then be relayed to other staff members. And that is how I started. And now I've kind of moved into this operational workflow piece as well.
Fantastic. Thank you for sharing that. That's a mind-blowing number of systems. I think you mentioned something like thousands of established processes that the team is performing on a monthly basis. So that's a huge amount to keep track of. Tell me, how did you handle that documentation before Scribe? What did the old way look like for you?
Well, not very well. Realistically, I think more often than not, when it comes to SOP documentation and how you create something that's engaging enough that's going to allow for individuals to actually self-train and self-teach themselves, I think it just kind of boils down to screen snips and doing PDF documentation. Obviously, the hardest piece about that is it's super labor intensive. So now you've taken a person away from actually doing a job where now they're doing an SOP creation, but then also the update process. If anything changes, like the software updates there, it puts a new release out and that button has now moved from where it used to be. You actually have to go back, find that Word document, recreate it, do the screenshot again. So it was extremely labor intensive in terms of how we used to do it.
Yeah, the old copy paste, I know, familiar to myself, to probably many on the call. I'm pretty sure I speak for all of us when I say we don't think of it very fondly. So I feel that pain that the team had in terms of both creation and maintenance of those documents and taking them away from what they're meant to be doing on a regular basis. So as the team moved into using Scribe, as you adopted Scribe as the platform for the document creation, tell me a little bit about how you started by defining those processes that needed to be scribed. How did you go about defining, like, what is the universe of that work, and how do you determine where you need these SOPs?
So at first, it was really kind of rudimentary in terms of how we mapped out this process. Myself and my team, kind of what I had tasked them with doing is that anytime you are doing a repetitive task, anytime that you do something every day or once a week or once a month that can be recreated via a Scribe, let's start recording those, let's start tracking those, and then let's start creating this repository. And then from that point, once we kind of started building out this little mini library of different scribes, we started to also then kind of loop in like our ticketing system and then common questions that were being asked. And from that point, once we understood like what are the questions that people are asking more often than not, what sort of processes are requiring repetitive training or repetitive instruction and information, that kind of allowed us to build the roadmap in terms of where do we start with defining a process? How do we start? What's being asked the most? And then from there, kind of just like building out that workflow, like in a lucid chart, so to speak, of saying, here are the key touch points, here's what's being asked, here's what people need. And then as we expanded upon those workflows or processes, just continually building more scribes into it. So kind of where's that bottleneck, and then following that chain all the way through to completion.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's awesome. I'm so glad you touched on that, because I know for a lot of folks, probably many folks on this call, the idea of tackling a huge process documentation project is really daunting. But the way you've described it, Connor, is it's really not taking any additional effort outside of what people are already doing in their day to day. And just through answering the questions, through identifying those procedures and scribing them as they're going, they're building up this library. So now you have this huge asset, this library. And I know there's a lot of ways it's benefited the team, and probably get into some of those KPIs in a bit, but they've been able to do that just really in the flow of their everyday responsibilities. So much different than before, when it was like, okay, set aside this chunk of several hours to copy paste a long SOP. And as we all know, that never really gets done for all the procedures where you need it.
And I think the beauty in that too is that it's not necessarily that you can say, hey, Jane Smith, please go do an SOP or document this. You can actually have 3, 4, 5, 6 different people creating this documentation, maybe for the same task, and then also start to do some task analysis around it as well.
Yeah, that is so huge. And that is insight that I'm guessing it was just not feasible to have before. How, Jane and John are doing it differently, which one's more effective, which is the one that you want to train everyone else or have available as the SOP for everyone else to be following.
Yeah, you're already losing that productivity with the one person. You can't afford to have 2 people doing the same job. Versus with Scribe, they're still doing the job, but they're just recording it at the same time.
Yeah. Oh, it's fantastic. Thank you for sharing that. So you're also in the healthcare industry, as you mentioned. So I know that there are some pretty stringent data privacy requirements that probably play in as people are recording their processes, again, in the scope of their work and production systems. Tell us a little bit how you manage that.
Well, in the past, it was just inherently difficult, because either you have to have someone that's manually going through these PDF documents and then spot checking for maybe a patient name or patient date of birth or something that just really shouldn't be there, and then it can't be distributed, or it can't be available to the public, so to say. And really what we would do is just in Word, create a little circle shape of black, and then just put it on there to black it out, and then make it a PDF. I mean, that was the way we had to do it. So, now, being that we're in healthcare, and obviously, data privacy is extremely important in this space. The redaction method within Scribe really enables us that as we create the scribes, you can do it on the fly. So when you're going back to the editing process, or if you're taking a break within that process, you can go and just, take the box, pull it over there. It gets redacted. But also, I think that's a great segue into how do we manage like that QA and ensuring that those individuals who are recording potential privacy issues, it could be a privacy issue, how do we make sure that it's being done correctly, and then that we can actually distribute these scribes, whether it's externally or internally.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is something a lot of folks are interested in. Maybe we'll dig into this a little bit more, and I think maybe you even want to show us how you're managing it today, an example.
Sure. Let me go ahead and share my screen here and go and pull up the Scribe workplace. So we're still like in the process of really building out this repository and the use case across the entire org. But the way we've been handling it so far is we've pretty much created a few different what I'll call kind of workspaces. And so how this has been working is we have like a collaborator workspace where we house all the content creators, and then also what I would call those QA individuals, those that are going into the work queues or the review queue and making sure that the process is being done correctly, and any sort of PHI or healthcare information that cannot be distributed is being redacted correctly. Once we have kind of created that content and it's gone through the QA process, it gets moved to a different workspace, which is kind of the public workspace where all of our users have access to that. Obviously, we have viewers and then content creators, but the review queue, what it allows us to do is you can see, we have all the ones verified here, not reviewed. And then as you go into and go through it, we can make sure that there is no sort of protective information that would be shared here. And then it's as simple as we can, provide feedback and comments, do the review. We can tell if it's under review. That's kind of how we use saying, hey, we're not quite sure, maybe this should be tweaked, or, let's get a second set of eyes on it. Otherwise, it would just go straight to verified. And then, so once it goes to that verified status, so to speak, as simple as just saying move to team. So we verified that aspect. We know that there's nothing, no potential risk there. And then from there, we move it to the public workspace, where all of the staff members of the viewers can then gain access to it and share it freely as well. One of the biggest concerns we had was, obviously having this many softwares and having the client volume that we do, is we have to create SOP and workflows. We can't go to every single client software and make one. We're going to make one just for one software, and we might be logged into just one client. So we also have to make sure that we're distributing this type of documentation externally to a different client, that we've also blacked out the client name or anything else that might identify, client A to client B. So that's another big piece of it as well. And we didn't want, people to then start asking questions of, hey, can I distribute this? Now it's become, if it's in this workspace, you can send it wherever you want, because we know for a fact that there's nothing identifiable in there.
That's fantastic. So you've tackled the creation process, the analysis of the existing procedures through getting different examples from different users. You're able to create the SOP much faster than the old copy paste that we talked about. And now you're able to distribute it to the end users in a way that they're able to effectively self-serve and leverage these. And through this review process, you've got the confidence that it's the right procedure, it's the correct data, it's been redacted appropriately. You're very confident in everything that's out there. That's so awesome.
Yeah, and I think another big asset here is kind of going back to whenever you had to update a prior SOP, it would kind of just be like, either you set a calendar reminder for yourself, or maybe you just remember to go in every once a month. But having the reminder system is also a huge benefit. Actually notifying the individual saying, hey, make sure you go check on this SOP you created and make sure it's still accurate. I think that's a huge piece. And then it can go back to that review process to then be redistributed as well.
That's awesome. So for those that are on the call that might not be aware, the review queue process that also triggers those reminders at regular intervals, those are enterprise functionality. If you're interested in what else enterprise can bring, if you're not currently on our enterprise subscription, talk to us. There's also some other amazing functionality you get access to. But I think some similar things that folks have used that are not an enterprise are potentially leveraging the folder structure for helping organize things that are under review or verified, and the two-team structure that you pointed out. That's really available to everyone. I think that's such a great solution. So thank you for highlighting that.
Of course.
So maybe to dig into that a little more, let's talk about how users are accessing the content today, how they're finding it, and what are some of the differences you found from maybe before, where you were answering ad hoc questions and one-off things, to now how the team is able to self-serve, find the scribes, find the procedures that they need.
Yeah, so obviously with the desktop UI, you do have your folder structure, the hierarchy set up here. And we've kind of organized it into pretty high level aspects where then, you can actually start drilling into them and then seeing, where certain subfolders live. If you're trying to find something within the Scribe UI, also the search feature, that was a big piece of the setup process, is that how do we want to name these types of things? How do we want to make it so it's easily searchable? So we kind of created a standardized methodology in terms of what does the naming look like, and then what categories or assets does it apply to? So this is kind of the UI piece, but I think one of the other huge benefits of Scribe is the fact that you can create public sharing links. So no longer are you just like sharing a static PDF document, you're actually sharing this link. So going back to that whole review reminder piece, if I go in there and I update this and it's still being shared around, that URL is going to update as well. So you're constantly sharing up-to-date SOP documentation. The other aspect and how we use it is, I'll come over here. So we use I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, Monday.com for project management, along with a variety of other internal processes. And we use it for different types of ticketing and request systems. So this is actually a system I developed that is in relation to different data requests for clients. And what we actually ended up seeing is that, so we kind of started with, hey, while you do something, make a scribe around it. If you're already doing it, why not do that? But then we started getting like these kind of rudimentary requests that were coming in saying, hey, like this really isn't a request for a data analyst to go prepare. This is something you can actually just like natively generate out of the software. There doesn't have to be any manipulation involved. And so what we started to do is actually complete tickets with Scribe. So sometimes a ticket comes in and you have to go in and do a variety of different things, and then you send back the file or whatever is being requested. But now other times, instead of them going through that process, they will just create a scribe and put the link in there, and it just sends the person an email saying, hey, your ticket's been completed, here's your scribe link. And then now they actually can start sharing that with other coworkers saying, hey, like I had the same issue, here's the scribe link for it, or they can find it in Scribe. And then on top of all of that, we've created like different, what I'll call like just data repositories. And a lot of these will house different links to different softwares. So we've kind of created like this ecosystem of you can find different scribe links and documentation, no matter where you are or whatever software you might be working in within the organization. So that's kind of like the biggest distribution medium we've been utilizing.
That's amazing. And again, taking work that someone is already doing to respond to a ticket, to answer a question, and then you're able to leverage that instruction over and over. And I think you mentioned you had some estimates around ticket avoidance and time saved by doing this, by creating this library.
Yeah, based upon the last time I looked at it, I think we actually reduced the number of, I call them like rudimentary tickets, by roughly 45%. So we were doing approximately 350 to 400 requests a month. And after implementing this whole Scribe process, and then as that repository built out, over the course of, I think it was 4 months, that volume dropped about 220. And then we started looking at, well, obviously, was it just the type of tickets that were changing? Was volume just decreasing? But we actually noticed that volume stayed pretty steady. We just had 150 or 200 less rudimentary tickets coming in on a regular basis. And a lot of these were also recurring tickets too. So this person might put a ticket in every single month or every other week over and over again. And now that person no longer has to go in, open the ticket, wait for the response. So it's kind of twofold. You're generating higher productivity on our end for our team, but then also it's a higher productivity for the person requesting because they're no longer spending the time to go in there and open that ticket and wait for it.
Yeah, that's amazing. 40, I think I saw in the chat, 45% is huge. That is a material difference. That's massive. That's awesome. And the investment on your team side was minimal, if at all, compared to what they'd be doing anyway in the course of responding to those tickets that came in. So that's huge. Awesome. So one more kind of story I want to ask you about, a scenario you've told us about before, is how recently you transitioned some tasks, some work from one team to another, and you leveraged Scribe to help with that. Tell us a little bit about how that project went, some of the results you saw.
Definitely. So Coronis, we are a global organization. So we do have offices offshore in India and the Philippines. And so as we kind of ramp up that staffing over there, one of the biggest challenges is how do you transition onshore tasks and processes offshore without having to go through that whole PDF SOP documentation, nightmare. So what we actually ended up doing is we, again, kind of went back and remapped based upon the scribes you already have. So we looked at some of the tasks that were pretty straightforward or simple, ones that wouldn't require a ton of training or onboarding for that offshore individual. And then we created that library, that repository, and then we kind of like staggered or systematically started transferring scribes to them, saying, hey, like now you do this one, now you do that one. And actually what it ended up doing at the same time, it expedited the training process. So we've now kind of removed the whole aspect of, hey, let's get on Zoom for an hour and do a screen share and walk through these things. So that's an hour of time back. And then we can kind of keep leveraging and keep adding more and more in there. And so then as their team is growing, they already have this repository. So now they can do a train the trainer on what they've been learning. And it just allowed us to expedite this kind of transition, which probably would have taken, I would imagine about 3 months to transfer about 120 tasks. We were able to do it in about 45 days.
Wow.
So it was a massive time saving. I mean, not just in terms of speed to market, so to say, but also the amount of time saved on our end and Zoom calls and SOP documentation creation and distribution and all these different aspects. And then at the same time, QA is almost already ingrained in here. So as long as they follow the Scribe step by step by step, because you're actually the one doing it, and like from a QA perspective, you're doing it correctly. As long as they follow it step 1 to 50, QA becomes a very, very minimal aspect. And if something goes wrong, more often than not, we've found it was because there was an issue or an error in the Scribe and not because they were doing something wrong. So it's kind of almost alleviated a lot of that QA effort too.
Yeah, that's amazing. So faster transition and higher quality in the work that's being done and the tasks that are being executed.
Yeah.
Amazing. Looks like we have a question from the chat. So somebody on the line is wondering, Connor, what was your document management system prior to this? Were you doing file share, SharePoint, and can you tell us a little bit about the adoption of Scribe? How's that been going and folks finding and self-serving documents?
So our original, and I guess kind of still to this day, like DMS system is pretty much Google Drive. So, we just have a variety of folders, shared drives and whatnot. And that's mainly how we categorize and retain all of our content throughout the organization. In relation to, I think, driving user engagement, I think this is always a challenge. People are usually used to doing things the way they've always done them. Change can be difficult. Change management can be difficult, especially in, the remote work environment, where you can't just, walk down the hall and say, hey, why aren't you doing it this way? My methodology for this has always been, as long as you drive engagement and encouragement with individuals, and you kind of take a really strict stance upon it, saying, hey, like, here's the Scribe, here you can go do it. Or if you want to, don't send me a PDF document that you created in Word. You have to be using Scribe. And so even though they spent that time, once you start to show that individual value and how it's actually going to benefit them in the long run, is how we've really gotten people to buy into the whole Scribe environment. And then also buy into the ideology that whenever you're doing something repetitive, make sure you always Scribe it. And even if you don't put it somewhere, like, that's fine, but you have it, because then what you can do from there is obviously go back into the Scribe and then add to it. And then you kind of create this self-sustaining ecosystem by, it's a trickle down effect, so to speak, is how I look at it. And that's really how we've gotten to such high engagement with Scribe through the organization.
That's awesome. Thank you for sharing that and answering that question. And I know from many months ago, as you started out as kind of one of the first really power users of Scribe at Coronis and bring it into your own kind of daily work life, you were modeling that behavior, and that allowed you to transition a number of tasks that were bogging you down on a regular basis and allow you to focus on some of these bigger, more impactful projects as well. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a huge believer that if you ever want engagement, it has to start the top down. You've got to be the one buying into it, the one using it, and the one distributing it, and the one being that champion of that product. In order, either you're just silly and you use the software that you shouldn't, or there's probably true value here. And if there's true value, what is he seeing that I'm not? And once people start to realize that, I think it's how they start sharing with their coworkers. And then it's kind of, it becomes systemic across the org via that fashion.
That's awesome. Well, thank you, Connor. I think that's fantastic advice for everyone here who's looking to leverage Scribe with their teams to see some of the benefits that you've had with your team at Coronis. over the past many months and many months to come. Continue to see those huge benefits around time savings, around performance improvement, around quality. I think unless there's any other questions from the group that we're able to open it up, Meg, I'll just say thanks, Connor, so much for being here.
There's one more question, just quick one. Eric's asking, Connor, can you just clarify that screen that you shared that had all the columns with the scribes in them? That was Monday, right? Where you go through and actually assign employees to different tasks.
Correct. Yeah, that was Monday's interface, but we've also done something very similar to what Monday would be, but just like built it in a Google spreadsheet. So it's a shared sheet. You know, it's very similar to what Monday would be doing. But you know, that's kind of how we did a lot of our transfer to the offshore group, is within just shared Google Sheets, and we just create them and then start stacking them, have different sheets in there. So it's a very similar process.
Cool. All right. Perfect timing. Thank you, everybody. Huge round of applause to Connor. Thank you for being here. Kayla, thank you so much for your moderation, and huge thank you to every single one of you for showing up. We will email the recording, and if you have any questions or feedback, please just let me know. Thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks all. Thanks, Connor.